Without further ado, Mr. Gita Wirjawan.
Thank you. Very good afternoon to all of you. I want to first say thank you to Pak Iwan for inviting me to be here in Ithaca. I got to say, it was quite a struggle this morning to wake up early in the morning and to be in a car and to drive out for 3.5 hours. But as soon as we got onto the countryside, I realized what a beautiful journey it was. And it kind of reminded me of my typical journey to a ski resort anywhere in the Northeast. I don't know if that means good or bad, but I just want to say that I'm very pleased to be here. And it's always tough to give a talk after lunch, especially if you've had some good desserts and lots of food. But I wanna try to spend the next few minutes talking a little bit about Southeast Asia. And this is a region that a lot of times gets undersold or underrated because in recent times and likely in the near foreseeable future or even longer, people around the world are going to be talking a lot about China and India when they refer to Asia. But Southeast Asia is not so bad. It's got scale, it's got interest, and I think it's got attractiveness that the world over needs to understand a little bit better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history. Then I'm going to try to talk a little bit about supply chain. To be quite honest, I didn't come up with a topic. Iwan came up with the topic, so I thought that would be cool to talk a little bit about supply chain. So I'll pretend as if I know a lot about supply chain. But, you know, we've been around, the planet's been around for about 4.5 billion years. And simple life forms started about 3.8 billion years ago, long before the school was founded. I just found out that your school was founded 100 years before I was born. So just to give you a bit of perspective of how old you are or the school is and how young we all are or I am. And complex life forms started only a few hundred years ago, a few 100 million years ago or 600 million years ago. And we basically went through a cognitive revolution about 70,000 years ago. That's when the primates became humanoids. That was the first time that we actually ever had a cloud computer. When our cortex became larger, our brain capabilities became bigger and better. And thereafter, about 12, 13,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution, that was pretty much marking the beginning of the Holocene epoch. And that's how basically humanity has come about. Now, how has the planet changed? It has repercussions on how we have lived as humanity. And we've gone through the conversion and transformation from soil to steel to data. And the gap between how this guy from California predicted how the memory chip capabilities are going to evolve in the next every year versus how humanities are coping, it's becoming more and more divergent. And it's actually causing a bit of a concern, particularly in the context of developing economies where regulators are having to cope with the acceleration with which technology is changing. And unfortunately, people within the regulatory framework do not have the luxury of being able to cope as easily as you might think. As such, the risk for not only disruptions, but the risk for dislocation is far greater in a great number of emerging economies. Indonesia is not excluded from that list because Indonesia has government officials, people in the regulatory framework who basically do not want to study, do not want to learn as quickly as people in the private sector. And countries like Indonesia or economies like Indonesia are basically filled with oligarchical tendencies that do not want to change when there is a disruption or there is a dislocation, to the extent that if they see this as a risk to their preceding business model, they're likely to play the regulatory card. So this is causing, I think, a bit of a problem in some economies. We're also seeing multipolarization. I remember when I was once in the government, I was in charge of the trade portfolio. Indonesia was confronted by the United States government and asked us to join the TPP. which stands for Trans-Pacific Partnership. At that time, I basically quipped that we would be more than happy to study the net benefit for a country like Indonesia. We were willing to show open-mindedness, but it would basically mean that, you know, if a country like Indonesia were to join something like a TPP, it has to also address how we're going to be able to move up the value chain, which also means that how we're going to also be able to increase our marginal productivity. And that, I think, was probably where the sentence stopped, unfortunately. And that's why Indonesia ended up not taking the position to join the TPP. And that was also reflective of how, in my view, I could be wrong, how the conversation on something that was very complex, very 22nd century, people were too busy intellectualizing the conversation as opposed to popularizing the conversation. And the difference between being able to intellectualize versus popularizing usually sits as the main problem as to why things don't get resolved in a trade negotiation and also economic cooperation negotiations. So centrality is diminishing, and you can basically argue that, you know, if you can't convince anybody in Makassar, which is a little town in Sulawesi, more than likely you're not going to be able to convince anybody in Mankato, which is a little town in Minnesota. And that's probably how somebody was able to popularize the conversation in 2016 and won the election in this country. The climate, it has also changed. If we go back in time between 1850 to 2000, we burned about 350 gigatons of carbon. 350 gigatons of carbon between 1850 and 2000. And within a span of 15 years, between 2000 and 2015, we burned the same amount of carbon, 350 gigatons of carbon. And if we go by the Paris Accord, the Climate Accord, which will be until 2030, we're allowed to burn about 500 gigatons of carbon. Now, if we were to go beyond 2030, if you talk to scientists around the world, practitioners around the world, who are in the business of burning fossil, there's probably likely to be only 2,000 to 3,000 gigatons left beyond 2030. If you go by the lifestyle that we're embracing today, which means that we're burning between 30 to 40 gigatons per year, we are only likely to have 50 to 60 years left worth of fossil. So that's how serious climate change risk is to all of us. God forgives. People often forgive, like your mother, like your wife, like your boyfriend. But nature doesn't forgive. Don't forget that. The decline of the price of money. This is simply underpinned by demographics. People around the world are getting older. They're getting older faster than they're getting younger, with the exception of India and Indonesia, where people like to reproduce. And as a result of the population of the planet getting older and being or having a very finite number of asset classes for the money to be invested, it is only likely that the price of money is going to come down, which means all of you who are graduating with the beautiful degrees from Cornell, you're going to enjoy decades of cheap money, if not cheaper money. So if you've got great ideas, it is more opportune, more possible, even more probable for you to be able to attach those great ideas to cheaper capital compared to the likes of me or Pa Iwan or even our fathers and grandfathers. So that's the benefit that you all have in the 21st century. So countries like Indonesia, unfortunately, are not experiencing the kind of declination of the price of money like the United States, Japan, and Europe. Just to give you an example, ever since the quantitative easing started in September 2008, the developed economies have done about $16 trillion worth of quantitative easing. That's between or amongst the US, Japan, the UK, and Europe. They've been printing that much money, $16 trillion. And that would have explained why the price of money has declined. But now we're likely to see reflationary tendencies, which have basically entailed governors of central banks in increasingly developed economies to raise the signal of increasing rates in the near foreseeable future to basically confront this reflationary tendency. ASEAN, which is a composition of 10 countries, from Myanmar all the way to the Philippines, has 620, 630 million people. And it is a $2.5, $2.6 trillion economy, the fourth or fifth largest economy around the world. It's gone through a pretty cool history. In the last 2,000 years, it's been graced by Buddhism between the year 400 and the year 800, approximately. It was graced by Hinduism between the 800 and 1400. And ever since then, it's a combination of Islam, Christianity, and also colonialism. By way of those compelling forces, in the last 2,000 years, the region of more than 600 million people has been able to stay peaceful, has been able to stay stable, as a result of which we've been able to robustly grow economically in the last 30 to 40 years. That assures many people in ASEAN or Southeast Asia that if we would have had 2,000 years of peace and stability, that served as capital for peace and stability in the next 2,000 years. And that is something that you cannot take for granted, given what you're seeing happening in many other parts of the world. So countries like Indonesia have gone through democratization. It was only 20 years ago that we democratized. And we democratized by way of militarily democratizing ourselves, which was a necessary precondition for any nation to democratize. And that was the advocacy that we gave to anybody that wanted to seek advocacy from us, one of which was Myanmar, which went through the same stage or phase of democratization that we went through 20 years ago. Now, is that likely to entail Southeast Asia as a player of the era of strategic relevance? We shall see. We have a combination of global and regional narratives. One narrative that you've heard over and over again in the last few years would be the One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road is basically a redo of what would have happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. And it will have basically implications, if not serious implications, on a number of verticals, if you want to do business or entrepreneurship. One of which is basically the movement of capital between one point and another. The second vertical would be the movement of goods and services between one point and another. And the third vertical would be anything that would be consumed by anybody within that route. And the last vertical that's going to be a beneficiary of this sub-narrative of the global narrative is data. As a result of which, you're seeing a lot of people in Southeast Asia talking about embracing data technology. You're seeing this sort of like transformative phases in the ride-sharing space, in the fintech space. When you take a look at countries like Indonesia, you know, it's a no-brainer as to why fintech is the way to go. When you have financial inclusiveness only at about 36%. That is the percentage with which people that are 15 years old or older have bank accounts. Only 36% of the population of 15-year-olds and older have bank accounts. So if you've got great ideas that connect people digitally between one place that's filled with money and another that needs money, you're likely to do well in a country with a population of 260 million people. And another is basically socialism with Chinese characteristics versus liberal democracy. This is the other narrative that is influencing the thinking amongst many people in Southeast Asia. Now, in the last 70 years, ever since the end of the World War II, people have been basically gravitating towards either the Soviet Union or the American liberal democracy. But in the last few years, there's a bit more confusion as to whether or not we go this way or that way. I could argue that for many decades, it was the era of defined benefit, if some of you are in the insurance business. We're moving from the era of defined benefit, where within the era in the last 70 years, if you comply with one guy, you're going to get your food. You're going to get your weapons. You're going to get just about everything you need. But now we're moving to the era of defined contribution. You've got to contribute. You've got to put skin on the game for you to be able to get the commensurate amount that you need or you want. And this is changing because you've got this rubber band that stretches between socialism with Chinese characteristics and liberal democracy. Whatever you do is going to have an impact on how much capital deployment is going to take place. Whatever you do is going to have an impact on how and the extent to which you're going to be able to advance your entrepreneurial aspirations, your economic aspirations, your whatever aspirations. So it's going to be an interesting time for many people, many countries in Southeast Asia. And of course, you've got the ASEAN Plus architecture. ASEAN has been the anchor of peace and stability for a long time, and ASEAN has been able to embrace a lot of countries that are neighboring to us, but also beyond neighboring to us, like the USSR or Russia, New Zealand, Australia, Korea, India, Japan, and of course the United States. These are narratives that are going to have a repercussion on the livelihood and the lives of many people in Southeast Asia. So, how do we compare ourselves with the European Union? The European Union is a $16 to $17 trillion economy. We're only about 2.6 trillion, a lot smaller. We're not unionized fiscally. We're not unionized immigration-wise. We're not unionized monetarily. But we're unionized sort of for political and social purposes, for economic purposes, and for basically political purposes to some extent. But we've been able to stay cohesively. The reason why we didn't probably unionize to the extent that the European countries would have is because you have one guy that earns less than $1,000 per capita per year. You have another guy that earns $60,000 per capita per year. It'd be tough to put 10 guys that are earning differently in a room to try to unionize everybody with the same aspirations. And that, I think, would have been not only the basis, but also the reason why we've been able to stay peacefully and stably in the last 2,000 years. We understand each other. When I was involved in the government and also in the regional conversations, I was always asked, why do you have so many meetings with your ASEAN fellows? You know, if you take a look at the ministerial and sub-ministerial levels, there's about 100 to 200 meetings per year. And there's always a question, what do you actually achieve in every meeting that you go to? You know, we would actually go to the meeting with a purpose of a meeting. We didn't go to a meeting with the purpose of getting something out of the meeting. And that was the difference as to why we understood each other. The fact that we were meeting and the purpose was just to meet, not to have an objective at the end of the meeting, was probably one reason as to why we've been understanding of each other better, as opposed to trying to mandate or prescribe a certain thing that belongs to you that needs to belong to someone else in that room. Call that Asian or call that Southeast Asian, I don't know. This is basically the footprint of the economies in Southeast Asia. You've got differing GDPs, GDP per capitas, different growth rates, and different traits. But if you take a look at all the trade value of Southeast Asia, it amounts to about only $3 trillion worth of goods and services. The goods amount to about 2.5 trillion. The services amount to about 500 billion. Very small. The global trade is about 30 trillion US dollars. So $3 trillion worth of trade for Southeast Asia only represents about 10% of the global trade. And if you compare that with the global GDP of over $70 trillion, it only represents about 3.5 to 4%. So the trade of Southeast Asia collectively only represents about 4% of the global GDP. Does that speak for a great extent to which Southeast Asia is part of the global supply chain? You could argue from a trade standpoint, 10% of the global trade, not so bad, not so small. Is that number likely to grow? Absolutely. Nominally, absolutely, and relatively. By way of the demographics, within the countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, we're likely to be able to trade more and better as we move up the value chain. And what are the other narratives that are going to drive that number up vis-a-vis the global numbers? Geopolitically speaking, connectivity is important. Southeast Asia is a point or region that connects the world over between this part of the world and that part of the world. India and the Pacific, Middle East and the Pacific, Europe and the Pacific, Australia and the Pacific, everything needs to run through Southeast Asia. Yearly, there is about $5 to $5.5 trillion worth of trade of goods and services that traverse through Southeast Asia. There is also the Malacca Strait, through which goods and services traverse inevitably. They have to. If you want to get oil or gas from the Middle East to Japan, oil or gas from Australia to China, and of course, your Oppo, Huawei, Xiaomi handphones from China to Indonesia, and iPhones also. I know some of you are iPhone fans, Samsung fans, but a lot of Indonesians now are bigger fans of Oppo, Huawei, Xiaomi, which look like Apple, but cost a fifth. The demographics. You take a look at this. Well, it works. The Indonesian population, out of 216 million people, 60% are younger than 39 years old. 60%. 50% are younger than 29 years old. And the urban population is between 50 to 60 million people. And the urban population is where the fintech community is chasing, is where the ride-sharing community, entrepreneurial community is chasing. And that number is only going to go up, not to mention the middle class. There's already 55 to 60 million people in the middle class, and that number in Indonesia is only going to go up to about 80 to 90 million by the year 2020. If you take a look at the whole Southeast Asia middle class population, by the year 2020, it's going to go to about 180 to 190 million people. That's staggering. China has about 500 million people in the middle class, which is a lot more staggering. But for a population of 620, that's growing, to have close to 200 million people in the middle class in the next couple of years, there's room for growth in a lot of verticals, in a lot of areas. So demographics is going to play a big role in terms of creating net assets. But also, there's potential in creating net liabilities. We don't do much about it. We don't infuse these youngsters with soft capabilities, with hard capabilities. There is a risk that it's going to be moving backward. So trade, we take a look at Southeast Asia trade. As I mentioned earlier, Southeast Asia trade represents about 3.4% of the global GDP, but it represents about 10% of the global trade, which represents a pretty good chunk, 10%, which argues or warrants a good extent of our representation in a global supply chain. Here's the trade number. 2.5 trillion. I mean, that's the GDP. Sorry, total trade. That's just goods, by the way. With services, about 3 trillions, which is 10% of the global trade. Now, what's a mockery is the intra-trade, which is not here. Oh, here. Look at this. In a context of a $2.5 to $2.6 trillion economy for Southeast Asia, we only trade with each other to the extent of 600 billion US, which is only 24 to 25% of our total trade. Why is it that we're not talking to each other? Or probably we're talking too much, but we're not trading with each other as much as we're talking to each other. It explains as to how and where we are in terms of the value chain. China is a lot farther up in terms of the value chain. We're not there yet. Singapore is way up. Malaysia is way up compared to countries like Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, even Vietnam, even Indonesia. But I'll tell you later as to how we're going to address all these. The top 10 Asian or ASEAN trade partners, 24% of the total trade is represented by the degree to which we trade with each other. And China is our biggest trading partner. It makes up about 14% of our total trade, right there. Japan, which used to be the largest trading partner, has come down to 9%. United States has come down to 8%. EU, 10%, and the rest, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, and India. But what we need to work on is basically the 24%. And that number is only going to go up if collectively and individually, amongst all 10 countries or economies in Southeast Asia, we'll be able to move up the value chain fast enough in the next few years or decades. The typical export commodities: Indonesia exports palm oil, cocoa, vanilla, all the natural resources, including coal, of course. And we import all the electronics, all the higher end of the technology. Right there, import commodities. Now, here's a picture from a financial market standpoint. Singapore has a market cap of the stock market to GDP ratio of close to 200%. It speaks of the degree to which you can liquefy your narratives. Whereas Indonesia stands at only 46%. Basically, the market cap of your stock market is only 46% of the GDP. It doesn't entail great liquidity avenues for anybody with great entrepreneurial skills, with great ideas. I've always told people that, you know, as many as we want to have the likes of Jeff Bezos in countries like Indonesia, it's still going to be tough for a Jeff Bezos who was born in Papua to be able to attach himself to capital. Jeff Bezos was able to grow because he was able to come up with this not only brilliant idea, but he was able to attach this brilliant idea to anybody who can take a 20 to 30-year view and not seek anything back in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's structural. Countries like Indonesia, if you're a Jeff Bezos, you come up with a great idea in the early 90s, try to get money from the bank, nobody's going to lend you. Try to talk to a PE, he'll want your money back in 5 to 7 years. Try to talk to a pension fund, they don't understand what online means. And it's still the case. So, structurally, if you take a look at the way money is structured, it's not adequately elongated. Meaning, the liquidity that sits within the system is not parked. in instrumentation that's adequately elongated. It's sitting in instruments that basically do not recognize great technological ideas, much less understand. Money that basically wants to return or be returned in the next 5 to 7 years. The PE paradigm does not work with great ideas. The pension paradigm works with great ideas. Debt to GDP, we're looking good. If you take a look at the public debt as a ratio to the GDP, we're still at about 25%. Indonesia. Southeast Asia ranges. Singapore is the most levered, okay, as a ratio. But I don't look at levered or leverage ratios too closely, because a lot of the extent to which you borrow depends on the extent to which you can service, right? It's not just the amount that you borrow. It's not just the ratio of your borrowing, but it's the ability to service your borrowing. Singapore has great ability to service its leverage. Indonesia used to borrow at close to 100% of its GDP around 20 years ago. We knocked it down to about 24 to 25%. We even set out, legislated a law that basically caps your deficit at 3%, which basically has allowed us or ourselves to be more disciplined than ever in borrowing. Malaysia is more levered, but has room to service its debt. But the debt to GDP ratio is something which I believe collectively ASEAN countries do not need to worry as much as we used to 10, 20 years ago. Now, how do we get there? How do we move up the value chain? This is a concern. We take a look at this number, $23,000. That's the amount of goods and services that the average Indonesian can produce per year on a PPP adjusted basis. Whereas the Singaporeans, they can do 125,000. It explains why Singapore was so eager to join TPP, right? Because you're at a much different ballgame level as opposed to other countries that are at a much lower level ballgame. So whenever you enter into a trade negotiation, you've always got to be able to address as to how you're going to be able to lift up this $23,000 worth of marginal productivity on a PPP adjusted basis to a much larger number. That way you can basically address a lot of things. And some other countries are basically in the same situation as Indonesia might be. Philippines at 16,000, Laos at 9,000, Vietnam at 9,000, Myanmar at 8,004, Cambodia at 5,004. China is at 21,000. China has 1.3 billion people. So this is the productivity page that a lot of Asian decision makers or ASEAN decision makers need to look at and be able to address. The middle class I talked about, we're going to grow to about 195 million people. China will have 500 million people in the middle class by the year 2020. But the growth of the middle class for ASEAN will be 57% from where we are today. China would have grown by 150%. Staggering. There goes the competition, which is why we're not trying to compete. We're just gonna try to play second. China is the Tiger Woods in the early 2000s. Right? Indonesia or ASEAN is probably the current Tiger Woods.
The Tiger Wood of the past or the present?
And we're the Tiger Woods of the present. Right? So it's a long shot, but we just got to keep grinding, using the words of Tiger Woods. So, supply chain depends on many of these. If you take a look at the kilometers of railroads We've got about 30 kilometers of railroads in Indonesia per 1 million people. That's not a lot. China has got 90 kilometers of railroads per 1 million people. That's a lot of kilometers of roads. I mean railroads. China has got 5 million kilometers of roads. We've got 450,000 kilometers of roads. But if you want to go into like a ride-sharing kind of business, you want to pick which countries in Southeast Asia have scale. Which are the countries that have scale in Southeast Asia in terms of population? Let me pause, take comments. Where would you pick if you want to do business in the ride-sharing in Southeast Asia?
Singapore here?
No, it's only got 4.5 million people. Indonesia, it's got 260 million people. Where else would you do it? I would pick any country that has a lot of traffic jam.
Philippines.
The Philippines.
Yeah, Thailand.
Thailand. Where else? Vietnam,
Vietnam.
right? 260 million people. Philippines, 103 million people. Thailand, 60 to 70 million people. Vietnam, 100 million people. Not so bad, right? But you got to take a look at the railroads. This is my personal view. Why? Because the ride sharing is the last mile, right? The last mile access is the business model. But you're not going to have a last mile business model if you don't have the long mile business model. And the long mile is the rail. It's not the roads. It's a lot cheaper to transport books and anything on rail because there's no traffic jam on rail. And countries like Indonesia do need to ramp up in terms of the number of kilometers of railroads. Philippines similarly. Vietnam and Thailand similarly. So the issue is, or the question is, how are you going to be able to raise that number of 30 kilometers of railroads per 1 million people to 90 like China does? Or maybe 100, or maybe 200. Given the fact that it's an archipelago, yes, you can air transport. But once you land on the island, there's a few big islands that can actually allow for you to build enough railroads. That, I think, is the game forward for you to be able to not only increase marginal productivity, but for you to pursue the last mile access business model propositions. Of course, port throughput capacity, airport throughput, capacity, and electricity consumption. You go to Singapore, it all lights up during the day, especially at night too, because they got electrification at 8,000 to 9,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Indonesia is only at 700. Right there. 730 kilowatt hour per capita. Singapore at 8,600. Malaysia at 4,300 kilowatt hour per capita. That explains a lot about the degree to which you can be participatory in the supply chain story. But a lot of this will depend on not just how the private sector is going to embrace the business propositions, but the fiscal space creation. And I think there's enough momentum amongst enough member countries in Southeast Asia as to create even more fiscal space. Indonesia is predicted to be the 5th largest internet ecosystem. Does that matter? Probably not, if they all use Facebook. But if they use other things, it's going to matter in a good way. Sorry, that was not meant to be whatever. But I think the Indonesians, the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, they need to take advantage of this journey by becoming smarter, by taking a look at how this pipe that connects digitally between one point and another, as for them to be smarter, as for them to be better and more educated. And if we take a look at the current space, the current pipe, it's not adequate. It's only at 50%. the internet penetration, whereas Singapore has more than 80%. The current type has only 20% smartphone capabilities in Indonesia. 23% in the Philippines, 40% in Thailand, Vietnam 26%. Just not enough. It has to be much higher than that. The number of universities. Indonesia has only about 700 universities, about 700,000 university students. Philippines has more than 2,000, close to 2,000 universities. They got more than 3 million university students. I hear there is what, 20 to 30 Indonesians studying at Cornell? That number ought to be 500, right? I'm like scaring some people here in the corner. And is there a reason for that not to be the case? Okay, I'll tell you a story. We legislated something a few years ago that would mandate the spending from a budgetary standpoint at minimum 20% for educational purposes. If you take a long view, spending 20% per year, 20% of your budget for educational purposes, you take the long view and assuming that your tax ratio is only going to stay at 12%, that's the ratio of your tax revenues vis-a-vis the GDP for the next 27 years until the year 2045. Why 2045? Because that's like 100 years after Indonesia became independent. We're going to be able to spend between $3 to $5 trillion on education, cumulatively, in the next 27 years. Now, don't you think that's enough to populate Cornell with 500 Indonesians per year? Assuming they pass the SAT scores, assuming they pass the GMAT scores. I mean, with $3 to $5 trillion to be spent on education, there's no reason for a country like Indonesia not to be able to populate campuses like Cornell with more than 20 to 30. So the long view, I was asked during lunch, what's your view of Indonesia? I think it's okay. We're going to go through bumps, trials and tribulations, but it's going to be like this. You go through episodic stresses, but directionality is important. Are you going to get better? Are you going to get less corrupt? Are you going to get more educated in the next 10 to 20 years? So when you're trying to market the country's thesis, you market based on directionality, not absolutes. And I think it's important for anybody in Ithaca to know that Indonesia is going to be able to spend between $3 to $5 trillion in the next 27 years, just on education. Now, a lot of that is going to go for basically fixing the dilapidated buildings in Papua, in Nusa Tenggara, in Java, in Kalimantan, but a lot of that could be used to give scholarships for people to go to Ithaca and all the other great schools around the world. And I think that's the optimistic tone of the narrative of Southeast Asia in terms of its becoming a part of the global supply chain. And what we're going to do is not dissimilar with what the Filipinos are going to do, the Vietnamese are going to do, the Thais are going to do. Because we meet all the time. We have coffee all the time. We talk to each other all the time. We share the same stories all the time. Okay, I'm taking this from the Price Waterhouse page. The playbook is that by the year 2050, Indonesia is going to be number 4, nominally and PPP adjusted wise. PPP adjusted, we're going to be at about $11 to $12 trillion. Nominally, we're going to be about $7 to $8 trillion. ASEAN will be about the same because we make up between 40 to 45% of ASEAN's economy. MAFGA. Anybody know what MAFGA stands for? Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. They're at the 5th largest today. On a nominal basis, on a PPP adjusted basis, they're number 9. Who's to know where they're going to be year 2050. There's probably going to be new acronyms because people just keep changing with new ideas, right? So this is basically the outlook for ASEAN. If we stick to the story, no reason for us not to be a pretty staggering, pretty sizable, pretty relevant, pretty coherent member of the international community, economically speaking. So you take the PPP adjustments, it'll be $30 trillion for ASEAN. Indonesia makes up about 11 to 12 trillions of that. You take the nominal approach, it'll be about 20 trillions. Indonesia makes up about 7 to 8 trillions of that. Sizable. But China will already be about 50 to 60 trillions by then. United States, 40 to 50. India will be 30 to 40. So ASEAN will be quite relevant at number 4. No reason for us not to be involved in good conversations in the next few decades. So the digital readiness of ASEAN countries. I can only point out that basically, this is key here. I meant to say financial inclusion, but my assistant prepared ATMs. But let me just summarize. The financial inclusion of countries like Indonesia stands at about 36%. That's the percentage for people that are 15 years old and older that have bank accounts. That needle will move up very fast in the next 5 years. Malaysia is at 85%. Singapore is at 99% in terms of financial inclusion. What about the remaining 1%? That's because this kid just doesn't want to have a bank account. It's not because of the lack of connectivity. There's a lot of connectivity in Singapore, but there's just 1 or 2 kids that don't want to have bank accounts. That's why they're at 99%. So, at the rate that some of you are going to go out with a great fintech idea and be able to attach that with long money, you're going to be able to move that needle from 36% to 40 to 50 to 60, all the way up to 100% in the next few years. It's not an impossibility. Now, the ride-sharing opportunity. Okay, I came up with this page a few nights ago, just dreaming. If we were to be able to spend as much money as I said we would, meaning on education, we'd spend $3 to $5 trillion, and on infrastructure, cumulatively in the next 27 years, if we just spent a few digits of a percentage points of the budget every year. Last year, by the way, we spent 60% of our budget on infrastructure. If we assume that we're going to be spending just 5% of our budget on infrastructure for the next 27 years, that's the kind of money we're going to be spending. $1.3 to $1.5 trillion on building the roads, the power generation capabilities. Where would that leave Indonesia in the year 2045? It's not impossible for us to have 4 doctors per 1,000. We only have 0.2 doctors per 1,000 people today. Not impossible for the ratio to go up to 4 doctors per 1,000 people. Financial inclusion, 95%, because the 5% just don't want to have bank accounts. Towards singularity, the amalgamation between machine and humanity. We're going to be the 3rd largest democracy after India and the United States. We're going to have a Gini ratio of 30%, hopefully. And ASEAN is more than likely to be still an anchor of peace and stability for the region, and hopefully the world. We might be able to put astronauts in space. We might be able to be in the top 5 in Olympics medal tally. Just to give you a sense, in 2016, Indonesia only won 1 gold. That was in badminton. I brag about this because I was chairman of the Badminton Association. We might be able to have won 10 Nobel Prizes, maybe in literature, hopefully in science, hopefully in STEM. We might be able to be a world soccer champion. we might be able to basically project soft power like the Koreans have done with K-pop. Any Korean in this class? All right, way to go. We might be able to serve as the middle power. Why? Because Indonesia stands with a good chance of bridging the gap between Islam and the West, between China and the West. It is geographically so neutral. It is geostrategically so neutral. It is geopolitically more neutral than before. No reason for this not to be a middle power. We're likely to move from Homo sapiens to Homo Deus by way of embracing singularity. The new kind of spirituality is looking down. Type Google, seeking answers to everything that you have. Questions over. Not looking up, asking God, asking your imam, asking your priest, asking your monk, or whatever. That's the new kind of spirituality. You even confide with your handphone with questions that you would never even ask your girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, or husband, priest, or imam, or rabbi. Infrastructure-wise, we're going to have 2 million kilometers of roads, going up from 450,000 kilometers of roads. Railroads, hopefully, we're going to have 90 kilometers of railroads per 1 million people. Megawatts of electrification, currently we only have 60,000 megawatts. Hopefully we can go up to 1 million. International tourist arrivals. This is the mockery, guys. Indonesia has more islands than Singapore, right?
No.
Correct?
Yes.
Singapore, I think, has 1 island. Indonesia, any Singaporean here? Indonesia has 17,000. Low tide. High tide, 14,000. Just kidding. Just trying to catch your attention. But we only got 12 million tourists last year. You know how many Singapore got? 23 million. How the hell is it that we're only getting half of what Singapore is getting with 1 island, us 17,000? Okay, I know the answers. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, whatever, right? But we're going to fix that. We've been fixing it. And we're going to build better airports. We have been. If you go to Bali, the airport now is a lot better than what it was 2 years ago. And that airport is only going to be much bigger and much better. And we're going to have more connectivity. Now, at the rate we're going to be spending that $1.5 trillion on infrastructure development, no reason for us not to be able to ramp up connectivity so that we can actually invite and be visited by 150 million tourists, including those from Ithaca and other parts of the world. Now, if we get 150 million tourists per year, oh boy, the School of Hospitality in Cornell is going to be filled with Indonesian students because we're going to need better chefs, better bartenders, better baristas, better anybody who is a stakeholder to hospitality management. And that is the low-hanging fruit because that is the easiest vertical to create jobs within. $338 million worth of spending on fintech. Is that great? In the context of a $2.6 trillion economy for Southeast Asia? Peanuts. China is outspending us on a per country, per capita, per whatever basis. That number needs to go up. And the reason why it hasn't gone up, because the local money is not well instrumented yet. If the local money is better instrumented, the non-local money will come in droves. That's the fintech space in Southeast Asia. It looks crowded, but a lot of mini-me's. Yeah, we got to get more of the big guys to come on board. We got to get the big guys to come with big capital in the billions. Tencent has invested in Gojek. Temasek has invested in Gojek. Of course, SoftBank has gone into Grab, and Grab has become the consolidator with Uber in Southeast Asia. And this is the public transport. Look at this. These are the two ride-sharing players in Southeast Asia, mainly in Indonesia, because Indonesia is critical for their narrative in Southeast Asia. They do well in Indonesia, they'll do well in all the rest. Gojek has been a local player, but Gojek is on a cusp of regionalizing into countries of scale. Grab has consolidated over Uber with a 20 to 25% stake in the combined entity. In each of the two players, Grab and Gojek has about 10 million users. 10 million out of the 50 to 60 million urban population. There's still a lot of upside. 10 million in the context of a country that's going to be spending $1.5 trillion on connectivity in the next couple of decades or more. And that's only assuming 12% tax ratio. If we collect more taxes, we're going to be able to build more roads, more connectivity. And the upside for any of these two guys is going to be really juicy. So that's the cross-shareholding picture for Gojek and Grab. You see the people upstairs? They dance with each other. Doesn't that speak for further consolidation? You got Temasek being exposed. You got Sequoia being exposed with Ali, with Apple, with Didi, SoftBank. So these are the two players. But upstairs, there's a lot of cross-shareholding with respect to other regional and global players. Inevitably, there's likely to be more amalgamation. Now, is that good for the customers or bad for the customers? Probably not so good, right? Because it'll be a one-player situation. So it's important for the policymakers to understand what's likely to happen in the near foreseeable future. There's likely to be antitrust issues here, or competitive issues, or non-competition issues. It's important for policymakers to have a better understanding of what's likely to happen in the tech space. So, the outlook for supply chain, I'm bullish. Why? On the fundamental basis that we're likely to be peaceful. We're likely to be stable because we've had peace and stability for the last 2,000 years. And we're likely still to be a conduit for many economies for goods and services. As to traverse through the Malacca Strait, the South China Sea, and we're likely to be a big beneficiary of the One Belt, One Road narrative. One Belt, One Road is the new 21st century version of the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan spent about 30 to 40 billion US decades ago. This one is going to be spending between 100 to 200 billion US as a start, which will be able to attract more than $1 to $2 trillion more of private money. Is that likely to entail good things for Southeast Asia? Absolutely, beyond the shadow of a doubt. Significant room for growth in fiscal space. I'm a big follower of Pa Iwan Aziz. No country, no nation will ever be able to develop without the development of human capital. As much as we're spending money on infrastructure, we've got to spend money on the soft infrastructure. Thank you very much.
With that note of optimism, now we have Q&A session. Eric, please.
I really want to thank you for an excellent presentation. Very, very clear, well delivered, convincing, although perhaps more convincing for somebody who's focused on the business side of things than perhaps other dimensions. I just have a few comments, if you will allow me. On regional integration, it seems to me, and I was brought up as a firm believer in multilateral trade. My dissertation, my PhD dissertation, was on the tendency towards regionalization in international trade from 1929 to 1960. So I really studied this. And the issue here is that pushing too hard on regional integration within the Asian countries could lead to what we call some trade diversion. And instead of, some degree of integration is essential. For instance, central bank harmonization in terms of policies and so on. But you ought to learn from the experience of the European Union what to do and perhaps what not to do. But I wouldn't go too far in pushing regional integration within Asia. And the reason for this is that when we start about supply chain, first of all, I would put it in the plural. We have many supply chains. And what is essential is for each Asian country to find its proper place in one of these global supply chains. And this means, in some cases, closer partnership, closer integration with China, with Singapore, with Taiwan, with the US, you name it. So a degree of flexibility in terms of not being essentially directed by rigid rules, integration rules, would make sense. Then in terms of the global value chain, again, I'm a firm believer in going up the product cycle, the product ladder, one rung at a time. And this is, of course, why East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea were so successful, and to a large extent in Indonesia itself. But it's a gradual process. You go up one rung at a time. I still remember around the turn of the century when Indonesia wanted to build an aircraft industry. That was a total failure. You can't leapfrog. So again, the extent to which you decide on having special trade and monetary relationships with other countries should depend on what your niche is in one of these various global value chains. And then finally, I think what you had to say about projecting the future was interesting, but none of us really has a crystal ball. But all of your projections, not all, but many of your projections were in terms of mass, GDP mass. And you didn't say anything about the distribution within this. It's only at the end that you said that you were an admirer of Iwan Aziz because of his interest in human development. So it seems to me that very fundamental, and perhaps just as fundamental, if not more so, than the actual size of GDP is the way in which it is distributed. It is the way in which human development in all of its various dimensions can be promoted.
Okay.
Mas Gita, you're still younger than I am, so you remember everything, right? Before you answer, any other questions so that I can collect? Yes, please.
My question sort of dovetails with the professor's final comments, and it has to do with SMEs. So my sense in Indonesia is that in the last 15 years, there's been a kind of stagnation for medium and large-sized industry, but a continual growth for SMEs. And so I just wonder if you have thoughts about increasing productivity for SMEs, since they represent a really large share of both individuals and businesses trying to engage in global value chains.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sure. I'll answer your question first. We have about 60 million small, medium entrepreneurs in Indonesia. And of that number, less than 30 million have bank accounts, right? So I always think of access of capital or access to capital as a precondition for any great idea to be actualized or to come to fruition. I think the reason why there's been stagnation within this space is not because of the lack of great ideas, but it's the lack of ability to access capital. Which is why I think the story of financial inclusion is important, and how that thing is going to change and the game change, the whole contour, not just for the small, medium, but the big guys too. So until then, I don't foresee a big change in this stagnating nature of the small, medium entrepreneurship. In reference to your three comments, I mean, multilateral conversation is something that I've studied, I've been a big student of, that I've been given a chance to be a practitioner of. But the problem with multilateral conversations is the tendency of populism that we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years. And I think one reason why populism has been able to thrive is because of the fact that prices have been held steady. There hasn't been, populism always sells. It's sexy to a lot of people when you don't see inflationary tendencies. You don't see panic in people. So you can basically throw anything at people and it sells. But at the rate that we're seeing potential reflationary pressure in developed economies, and I think soon thereafter in emerging economies, perhaps the degree to which populism sells will decline. And the rubber band is likely to swing back to the opposite of populism. You can call it elitism or non-populism. And I think the chance of being able to successfully advance multilateral conversations is far greater when populism is not within the conversation. And I think that is likely to happen in the near foreseeable future. And as much as we try to advance multilateral understanding, we came in Southeast Asia from a background where we were thrown by the more developed economies with respect to intellectual property, government procurement, pharmaceutical moratorium. These are all 22nd century stuff, okay? And I came back with a very simple request. And I wasn't the only one. The Filipinos did, the Thais did, with a simple request. Can you give me a sentence? Can you give me a sentence? We'll comply with your intellectual property aspirations, but you got to give me a sentence that says GM is going to build a factory in West Java that will build 30 cars per annum. I'm not asking for 350,000 cars, just 30 cars per year, because I need to be able to sell that to the parliament. I need to be able to socialize the thesis of intellectual property that is so advanced with the notion that there's real money that's actually going to come in from our trade partner. Which is why I made the point that we got a little too busy intellectualizing the conversation as opposed to popularizing the conversation. Inevitably, or unfortunately, politics kicks in multilateral conversations. But I'm a lot more optimistic now about being able to multilateralize conversations. And, you know, many countries in Southeast Asia took the view with respect to RCEP. RCEP is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Arguably something that would have been advanced by China, not the United States. TPP was. Now we've got a more brief or abbreviated version of TPP, ex the United States. RCEP was what I call the 19th century model. TPP was the 22nd century model. And in politics, maybe, arguably, it's easier to roll forward from 19th century to the 21st century because you don't stumble upon social, communal, political, geopolitical issues, as opposed to trying to rewind backward from a 22nd century thesis because you're likely to stumble more. But I see the way being paved more now for multilateral conversations at the rate that populism is probably not going to be as sexy as ever, at the rate that prices are going to go up, depending on what the central bankers are going to be doing or how they're going to take a view on things. Now, in terms of moving up the value chain, you can go with the China model, or you can go with the traditional Southeast Asian model. China took a bold view on going with artificial intelligence, right? They decided to just quantum leap to the upper echelon of the value chain by way of consciously trying to dislocate the manufacturing jobs to Southeast Asian economies, to Costa Rica, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and all the rest. Now, is that something that Southeast Asian economies are likely to do? To some extent, yes. Because the way I see Southeast Asian economies behave, it's largely been influenced by economic activities, economic cooperation, economic conversations involving the Chinese for the last 2,000 years. There's likelihood of replicating, copying and pasting business models that are pre-existing in China onto the Southeast Asian landscape. Consequently, you're likely to want to try to jump forward. Case, for example, is Indonesia, where we lack coding capabilities. We don't have coding capabilities like India does, like China does, like Korea and Japan do. Are we just going to sit back and focus on textile and shoemaking? I don't think so. If there's ever good money to be spent, it's probably good for us to spend a heck of a lot more money on getting more scale of the population to learn about coding so that we could maybe jump 1 or 2 echelons of the value chain. Now, I agree with you, the airplane example was not a great example, you know, and I think it was a classic case of not just understanding the economics of it, but not understanding the business of it. And I think if we were to do it again, we might be able to do it slightly better because now it's more relevant to have planes. At that time, it was probably less relevant. And it's probably more apt that we have business or better business instincts.
And you're further along.
Correct. So that would be my answer.
What about on my third point, which is your concentration on GDP as opposed to how the pie is divided?
I figured if I had an hour and a half, I should speak with a note of optimism, not a note of pessimism. But let me give you a bit of the pessimistic dosage. I talk a lot about the spending on education, okay? We spent 20% of the budget on education. That was about 30 billion US last year. And 50% of that was just for accreditation purposes. So if you're a teacher, you got to get accredited every year for you to be able to teach again. And let me give you some facts. 70% of the teachers, or maybe 60% of the teachers, are not well credentialized. Are you going to edit this out of the video later? Can you? I might go to prison. Look, all I can say is, allegedly there's leakage in the way money is being spent for educational purposes. But I think the more noble question is there likely to be less leakage, relatively speaking, going forward? Absolutely. So if you believe that there is less likely to be leakage going forward, directionally speaking, warrants a note of optimism. Let me stop right there.
Yeah, Ralph.
Yeah,
Yes.
I want to thank you for a beautiful talk. I enjoyed it immensely. In fact, your talk helped to condense my 2 questions into one. Back to the value addition theme, and if we're not going to move into a regional trading bloc, and we know there are a lot of impediments to value addition, and that's the key driving trade within the region. What are the prospects of having a more South-South dialogue? Trade between Jakarta, Cape Town, Sao Paulo, Mexico City. What about the South-South dialogue? What are the problems there?
Pragmatically, yeah, not much. I mean, we tried that many times.
Yes.
Even when I was, within the policymaking body, we tried. I made so many trips to the places you mentioned. The conversation was exciting, but to begin the undertaking of getting goods and services moved between one place and another was difficult. It just pragmatically speaking, it's a lot easier to move
North-South.
Yeah, and I'm not suggestive of a dire scenario, but if I can speculate, the likelihood of countries like Indonesia joining a TPP is relatively high. On the back of what I've said earlier, which warrants that Indonesia decisively wants to be a multilateralist. We're not bilateralist by nature. The reason why we're bilateralist is because we want to take the easy way out, short term. But the long view is that we all have to be multilateralist.
Yes, please.
So thank you for the lecture. I'm in
Thank
the
you.
city.
I'll give you my bank account number.
I'm in the city and regional planning department with Professor Iwan, and my question has to do with cooperation. And it seems like a lot of the optimism that you spoke of is tied to this idea that ASEAN is going to be such a large player in the global economy. But that requires a lot of regional cooperation. And then a lot of the detailed information that you gave had to do with Indonesia, which makes complete sense with that fintech and infrastructure and whatnot. And I'm just wondering how, like the One Belt, One Road and TPP, these are global initiatives that are bringing ASEAN out, you would say, more together. How do you said you meet and you just meet and that helps, but can you be a little more specific about how you see that regional cooperation developing between these nations?
The reason why we don't rub the wrong way on each other is because we meet so often that we understand where everybody comes from. One guy comes from a place where the GDP per capita is $1,000. Another guy comes from a place where the GDP per capita is $60,000. Another guy at $4,000. You meet 20 times in a year, you understand why he said what he said. You understand why she said what she said. And the more you're not likely to prescribe upon someone else a pre-existing model within your place. That, I think, speaks of courtesy, speaks of respect, but to some extent speaks of slowness. But my point is the slowness of progress is actually the very reason why we'll remain stable and peaceful. Anytime you try to be provocative or prescriptive among or upon each other or upon someone else, that actually causes episodic stress, which probably warrants, non-peace or instability. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, the Asian way of thinking serves probably better for us. But then again, there's the political leadership part of the equation, right? The political leadership part of the equation needs to prove that he or she is efficient. He or she is proficient. He or she is effective in leading, as to stamp out extremism, as to stamp out corruption, inefficiencies, irregularities, and all that good stuff. Until then you're going to have the divergence that you've seen in the last 2,000 years, but still peaceful.
Okay, we can entertain one more question. Yes, please.
Hello, Pak Gita. So I have a question regarding the infrastructure. So you mentioned tourism. The tourism also has three factors, 3A: accessibilities, amenities, attractions, right? And then you also mentioned about the access to capital. Right now, what is your thought about real estate investment trust within ASEAN? Thailand is already growing right now with the REITs, but I personally I have no idea about REITs going on in Indonesia. But then with the tourism also growing, this sector might be beneficial having the access to capital from that sector, from that financing.
Look, I think Thailand is ahead of Indonesia in terms of capturing the potential of REIT opportunities. It all depends on the cap rates. And to the extent that you can justify the necessary cap rates demanded by the investors, which unfortunately or fortunately only want to look at exchanges like Singapore, then you're good. And the storyline needs to be crafted. I think the storyline is pretty well crafted today for definitely Thailand. I think for the Philippines and Indonesia, which have become investment grades. The fact that Philippines and Indonesia have become investment grade is a good chunk of the storyline. Then the development story. The development story has got to produce the necessary sub-storyline of having adequate, cap rates. And, with good governance and all that, you can basically flush that thing up through the exchange in Singapore and be able to recapitalize through alternatives in a good way. And I think a lot of this is going to happen in the next 5 years. But the problem with, real estate stories in places like Indonesia, the rental stories, which are the underlying premise of a REIT, right, do not happen enough of a scale. They happen just in Jakarta, not even in other primary cities, much less the secondary cities like Solo, Jogja, Palembang, Makassar, and all that. But Jakarta in itself is going through a bit of a compression of value proposition that the rental component is not justifying of the necessary cap rates for a REIT opportunity. But will that change? Of course, for the better.
Okay. Now, thank you, Mas Gita. And for your information, this program was jointly organized by 4 institutions. One is the Department of City and Regional Planning. The second is Program of Regional Science. The third is Johnson School, which is the business school. In particular, the Emerging Market Institute. And the last one is the Southeast Asia program. So thank you, but officially the session will be closed by the persons who represent the first 2 institutes, i.e. the Department of City and Regional Planning and Program of Regional Science. And I'd like to invite Kiran, please.
Thank you, Leland. I put the official seal on the event. So on behalf of that august list of institutions and programs, I want to thank you very much for providing us with a most insightful and well-presented public lecture on supply chain and many other subjects. And on behalf of everyone, thanks so much. And still to be century.
Yeah.